I spent almost 5 years working nights as a janitor at a middle school. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended when the school buses began rolling in at sunrise. Initially, I really enjoyed the work. No rowdy students racing through corridors, no teachers griping about this or that, and honestly, no people at all. The silence never bothered me much, and I appreciated having space to get my tasks done without interruption. But as months turned into years, I began noticing how dramatically different the school atmosphere became after dark. It wasn't simply quiet anymore. The whole place felt lifeless. The structure would creak and moan like something alive taking deep breaths. When you're the sole person inside a building that big, even tiny noises will make you jump. You'd catch the sound of a locker door swinging open by itself, or hear water pipes banging behind the walls, and your mind would instantly think someone was walking around. I got pretty good at brushing off most of those sounds, but there was one area of the school that always made me uncomfortable: the basement level. The building dated back to the 1950s, and the basement stretched under about half the structure. Unlike the nice finished classrooms upstairs, this was basically a concrete labyrinth filled with storage areas and narrow corridors. Pipes and electrical cables hung down from the ceiling everywhere. Some rooms were packed with old school desks. Others contained boxes of outdated textbooks. Still others had broken furniture stacked to the roof. The air down there always felt thick and damp. The fluorescent lighting buzzed constantly and blinked on and off when it worked at all. Most of the time, you needed to carry a flashlight just to navigate safely. During my first week, one of the senior custodians warned me to stay out of the basement unless absolutely necessary. He claimed it wasn't worth the hassle and joked that ghosts lived down there. I laughed with him, but even in those early days, I felt genuinely uneasy whenever I had to venture into that section. It was like entering a completely different realm compared to the bright hallways on the upper floors. Some nights I'd walk past the basement entrance and get chills just from glancing at the door. Fortunately, my regular duties rarely required me to go down there, so I avoided it whenever I could manage. About 2 years into the position, I found a task list taped to my cleaning cart that included retrieving a set of folding chairs for some school event. I groaned immediately because those chairs were stored exclusively in the basement. I stood at the top of the basement stairwell for at least a full minute, considering whether I could ask my boss if the job could wait until morning, but I didn't want to seem lazy or difficult. So I picked up my flashlight and pulled open that heavy door. Every footstep I took down those stairs seemed to echo way too loudly. I reached the bottom and hit the light switch, but only a couple overhead bulbs flickered on, leaving most of the corridor in complete darkness. The smell of wet concrete was overwhelming. I clicked on my flashlight and started walking toward where the chairs should be, the second storage room on the left side. The first room was crammed with old desks piled clear to the ceiling. The second door was half-eaten with rust and made a horrible screeching noise like fingernails on a chalkboard when I yanked it open. Inside, everything smelled like dust and old wood polish. The folding chairs were leaning against the back wall in uneven stacks. I bent down and began pulling them out, trying to grab as many as possible so I wouldn't need to make multiple trips. I had just picked up 4 chairs when I completely froze. Somewhere out in the hallway, I could hear a soft scraping noise, like someone slowly dragging their foot across the concrete floor. I held my breath, still crouched down with the chairs in my arms, listening as intently as I could. The sound stopped completely. I stood up straight and stuck my head out into the corridor, sweeping my flashlight beam in both directions. The light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything unusual. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I waited there for what seemed like forever, before convincing myself it must have been the water pipes. Or maybe I had accidentally bumped one of the chairs. I carried the first load out into the hallway and headed toward the staircase. As I walked, I suddenly felt a cold breeze hit my face. It was so unexpected that I stopped walking immediately. The basement was always warm and stuffy with no windows and no air circulation. This felt like standing next to an open refrigerator. I shined my light up and down the hallway, but everything looked exactly the same. I shook off the weird feeling, set the chairs at the bottom of the stairs, and went back for more. When I entered the storage room again, something seemed different. The remaining stack of chairs looked like it had shifted position while I was gone. I stared at them, trying to remember exactly how they had been arranged before. Finally, I decided I was just being paranoid and grabbed another armload. As I turned to leave this time, I heard it again. A thump followed by that same scraping sound. It was coming from further down the basement hallway. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I pointed it in that direction. About 20 feet away, one of the classroom doors that should have been shut tight was now cracked open. My stomach dropped like a stone. I knew for certain I hadn't touched that door. The school was locked up completely every night, and nobody was supposed to be in the building except me. I stood frozen in the storage room doorway, staring at that partially open door. Every instinct told me to drop the chairs and run upstairs immediately. But I couldn't move. I kept telling myself logical explanations. Maybe the door latch was loose, or perhaps when I opened other doors, it created air pressure that pushed this one open. I held on to those explanations like they could save my life. I quickly carried the chairs to the stairwell, then returned with just my flashlight in hand. The cracked door was still there, open just wide enough for someone to look out. My throat went completely dry. I crept toward it slowly, each footstep echoing loudly. When I got close enough, I called out, "Hello? Is anybody down here?" My voice cracked and sounded tiny in that huge, empty basement. No response. I swallowed hard, then quickly pushed the door all the way open with my free hand and shined the flashlight inside. The room was empty. Just shelves of dusty science equipment, cardboard boxes stacked high, and spider webs in every corner. I stepped inside for just a moment, heart racing, listening for any noise at all. That's when I heard it again. That dragging, shuffling sound. But this time it was behind me in the hallway. I spun around and aimed the flashlight beam down the corridor. Nothing there, just shadows and concrete walls, but I could feel it. That heavy sensation you get when you know someone is watching you. My skin got goosebumps all over. I didn't care about the remaining chairs anymore. I backed up slowly, keeping the flashlight pointed down the hallway, and made my way toward the stairwell. When I reached the stairs, I grabbed the chairs I'd left there and carried them up 2 steps at a time. I didn't stop running until I was back in the main hallway upstairs, breathing hard. I leaned against the wall, sweating even though the school felt cold. I kept trying to convince myself I was imagining everything. Maybe it had been rats or settling water pipes, but I couldn't come up with any reasonable explanation for that cracked door. I locked the stairwell door behind me, even though that wasn't part of my normal routine, and I refused to go back downstairs for the rest of that shift. A week later, I was mopping the hallway directly above the basement stairs when I heard it again. 3 loud banging sounds, evenly spaced, like someone punching the wall with their fist. The mop slipped right out of my hands, and dirty water splashed onto the floor tiles. I froze completely and listened. Then I heard the basement door rattle like someone had slammed their body against it from the other side. My blood turned ice cold. I didn't open that door. I just stood there gripping the mop handle until the sound stopped completely. After that incident, I refused to go down into the basement by myself ever again. If anything needed to be brought up from storage, I would wait until another custodian was available to go with me. I never told my coworkers what I had experienced because I knew they would either laugh at me or blame it on the so-called ghost. But I know what I felt and I know what I heard. Even today, when I think about those slow dragging footsteps behind me in that dark hallway, I feel sick to my stomach. I worked nights as a custodian at a high school for 3 years. Being the newest person on the team, I usually got assigned the overnight shifts. The building was enormous, 4 floors plus 2 gymnasiums. At night, when it was completely empty, navigating it felt like wandering through a giant puzzle. The standard procedure was to work floor by floor, room by room, switching off lights, emptying trash bins, and securing doors. It typically took the entire night to cover everything properly, and if you tried to rush through it, you definitely missed something important. One Friday night, I was working alone because one of the other custodians had called in sick. Normally, we worked in pairs, so I wasn't accustomed to being the only person on duty. Initially, the shift seemed routine. I started on the first floor, emptying garbage cans, wiping down surfaces, and mopping the corridors. The lights in some of the older hallways flickered constantly, which made the shadows dance around. But I told myself it was just normal building maintenance issues. Around midnight, I headed up to the 3rd floor. That particular floor always gave me an uncomfortable feeling because it was much quieter than the others. It contained many older classrooms that weren't being used anymore. Some were permanently locked, while others had been converted into storage rooms filled with dusty textbooks, broken furniture, and outdated lab equipment. As I walked down the hallway, I passed rows of metal lockers. The metallic clicking sounds of the doors combined with the echo of my boots on the tile floor made me jump several times. I kept reminding myself these were completely normal sounds. I was halfway through mopping one of the main corridors when I noticed a door about 20 feet away was standing open. This immediately caught my attention because I had already checked all the rooms earlier that evening, and every single door had been locked tight. My first reaction was to walk past it quickly and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but something made me stop. I set my mop against the wall and walked over slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. It was one of those old wooden classroom doors with a square glass window. I pushed it open carefully, shining my flashlight inside. The room appeared empty. Student desks were stacked along the walls, and cardboard boxes sat in the corners. Nothing seemed unusual at first glance, but then I noticed that one of the boxes near the back wall had been moved. It was tilted at an angle, not lined up with the others, and there were scuff marks on the floor like someone had dragged it across the tiles. My stomach sank. I knew for certain I had closed that door earlier, and I definitely hadn't moved any boxes. I tried to convince myself it was probably nothing, just my imagination playing tricks because I was tired. I pulled the door shut and returned to my mopping, but my mind kept returning to that room. I kept thinking I should check the windows. Maybe a student had somehow snuck inside, but all the windows were locked from the inside and the hallway doors were secured as well. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched and concentrate on my cleaning tasks. After finishing that hallway, I went to the stairwell to head down to the second floor. As I walked past that same classroom again, my heart nearly stopped beating. The door was wide open again. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I had shut it before. I slowly stepped closer and peeked inside. The room looked normal, except the box was now sitting in the center of the floor. My pulse was racing out of control. I whispered, "Hello? Who's in here?" My voice sounded incredibly small in the emptiness of the building. I waited but heard only silence. And then from the back corner of the room, I heard slow, deep breathing. Not air from a ventilation system or creaking pipes. It was definitely someone trying to stay quiet, but making sure I could hear them. I tried to convince myself it was a student hiding and playing a prank. But how could they have gotten inside? I was the only person who was supposed to be there, and all the entrances were locked. I slammed the door shut and ran down the hallway to the stairwell. My heart was hammering and sweat was running down my back. I stayed pressed against the stairwell door, listening carefully. I debated calling my supervisor, even though I hated disturbing him in the middle of the night. Finally, I made the call. When he answered, I explained what was happening, trying to keep my voice steady. He said he would be there in 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt like several hours. I stayed as far away from that room as possible, looking over my shoulder every few seconds. Finally, he arrived. We went back upstairs together. He had a large flashlight and walked straight into the classroom. The box was still sitting in the middle of the floor. We searched everywhere. The closets, under the tables, behind the desks. There was absolutely nothing. He suggested I was just tired or imagining things. I didn't argue with him, but I knew what I had heard. That slow, heavy breathing. I tried to finish the rest of my shift with him there, but I kept glancing at that classroom. The hallway felt colder and more oppressive than ever. Even sweeping and mopping didn't distract me from the uneasiness. Every time I passed a locker, I expected it to swing open. Every shadow looked like a person standing just out of sight. Weeks later, when I was working with another custodian, he told me that years ago, a student had been caught hiding in that exact classroom overnight. They had snuck in to pull a prank, but it frightened the staff so much that they stopped using that room completely. It made logical sense, but it didn't explain the breathing I heard that night. There was definitely no one else in the school building. I completed the shift and left. But every time I thought about the experience, my stomach would twist into knots. I started taking extra safety measures. I made sure all doors were locked as I passed them. I kept my flashlight aimed at the floor and stayed close to the stairwell whenever I had to walk down that hallway. Months later, I had another overnight shift by myself. I avoided that third floor for as long as possible. When I finally had to go up there, I moved as quickly as I could. I kept expecting to hear it again, that breathing sound. The feeling of being watched never went away. Even when I was in a room far from that classroom, I felt like eyes were following me. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I finished the shift and left quickly, never looking back. I refused to work that floor alone after that. Even years later, I avoided it whenever possible. I never found out whether it had been a student hiding or something else entirely. But I'll never forget the sound of that breathing coming from a classroom that should have been completely empty. I can still hear it in my head sometimes. I worked as a night custodian at an old high school for 2 years. The most challenging part of the job was always cleaning the auditorium. It was huge with 3 levels of seating, a large stage, and long, heavy curtains hanging from the ceiling. During daytime hours, it looked perfectly normal. But at night, when the building was empty, it felt like entering a completely different world. Even with all the lights turned on, there were shadows in every corner that seemed darker than they should be. Sound behaved strangely in there. If you dropped a broom, the echo would stretch and bounce around, making it impossible to tell exactly where the noise originated. Most nights, I saved the auditorium for last because I absolutely hated going in there. There was just something about that space that always made my skin crawl. Near the end of winter one year, I had to clean it earlier than usual because there was going to be a play the next morning. I arrived around midnight, dragging my cart behind me. The side door made a loud creaking noise as I opened it, and when it slammed shut behind me, the echo traveled across the entire empty room. I started by sweeping the aisles between the seats. Some chairs were old metal folding seats bolted to the floor, while others were loose. As I pushed the broom along, I listened to the scraping sound bounce off the walls and ceiling. After a few minutes, I thought I heard something else. It was quiet at first, like a soft rustling noise from the stage area. I stopped moving, thinking maybe a prop had fallen over. But when I looked toward the stage, it was completely empty. I shook my head and told myself it was nothing unusual. I continued sweeping. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was more clear. The sound of slow footsteps walking across the stage. I stopped sweeping and stared toward the stage. I could see props stacked in the corners, but nothing was moving. The sound was definitely real, though. My breathing became shallow. I slowly climbed the steps onto the stage, shining my flashlight behind the curtains. There were ropes, pulleys, old chairs, and painted scenery stacked against the walls. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, and my light beam made it look like everything was shifting slightly. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was very close by. I backed off the stage, telling myself it was just the old building settling, maybe a mouse running around in the ceiling. But the uncomfortable feeling wouldn't leave me alone. I continued sweeping the aisles, trying to finish as quickly as possible. My mind kept returning to the stage. The sound of those slow footsteps kept replaying in my head, even though I couldn't hear them anymore. I finished sweeping the lower level and started mopping. As I pushed the mop through the rows of seats, I thought I saw a shadow move across the second tier of seating. I aimed my flashlight toward those seats, but nothing was there. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the lighting. I kept my back against the wall as I worked, feeling like someone was standing behind me. I had nearly finished mopping the main floor when I heard it again, a whisper. I couldn't understand any words, but it was low and deep, and it was definitely coming from the balcony seats above me. My heart started hammering and my flashlight beam shook in my hands. I wanted to run immediately, but I didn't. I had to complete my job. I told myself it was probably someone outside the building, or maybe another janitor who had forgotten something. But I knew I was completely alone in there. I kept mopping slowly, straining my ears to listen. The whispering continued, and it almost seemed like it was getting closer to me. I tried calling out, but I was so nervous that my voice sounded weak and shaky. There was no answer, only the echo of my own voice bouncing around the empty auditorium. I finished mopping the main floor and started cleaning the stage itself. The steps up felt endless, and every time I moved my flashlight, I thought I saw something just at the edge of the light beam. Sometimes it was the flicker of a shadow. Sometimes I was sure it was just my imagination running wild. When I reached the stage, I looked out over the main floor. The seats stretched back into the darkness. I shined my flashlight up into the balcony, and for just a moment I thought I saw a figure sitting there. Just a dark silhouette. But when I blinked and looked again, it was gone. I told myself it was probably just a chair or maybe a coat someone had left behind. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I started dusting and rearranging props, trying to focus on something physical and concrete. The whispering came again, much clearer this time. It sounded like someone speaking my name almost directly behind me. I spun around so fast that the flashlight nearly slipped out of my hands. The stage was completely empty. Nothing there at all. The props were still stacked in exactly the same places and the curtains weren't moving. But I knew I hadn't imagined that voice. I backed away slowly, heart racing, and moved toward the side exit door. I stopped at the edge of the stage and listened carefully. I could hear soft footsteps on the upper levels, moving slowly across the balcony seating. I told myself it was impossible. The auditorium was locked tight. No one else was supposed to be in there. The footsteps continued, stopping and starting as if someone were pacing back and forth while watching me. I finally ran to the door, grabbed the handle, and yanked it open. The cold night air hit me like a wall, and I felt immediate relief. But I could still hear the faint echo of footsteps above, slowly fading away. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely lock the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, feeling sweat running down my forehead. I didn't go back inside that night. The next morning, I tried telling another custodian about what had happened, and he laughed at me, saying, "It's an old building. It probably just settles and makes weird noises." But I wasn't convinced. That whispering voice calling my name so softly and deliberately, and those footsteps pacing above me. I could feel them in the air around me. Weeks later, I learned that years ago, a drama teacher had died suddenly in that auditorium during a rehearsal. Heart attack, right there on stage in front of his students. People said that sometimes you could still hear him walking around the stage at night, or hear whispers coming from the seats. I tried to convince myself it was just a story, that the sounds were normal for an old building. But the way that voice whispered my name and the way those footsteps echoed, I could never forget it. Maybe I was losing my mind. I honestly don't know. After that night, I refused to clean the auditorium alone. I quit that job not long afterward. But sometimes, even when other people were in the building with me, I would feel that same cold pressure in the auditorium and get that same feeling of being watched. I know what I experienced was real, at least real to me. I've never had any kind of mental health episodes or anything like that, so this whole thing still just puzzles me to this day.